I want to buy a business. I want to buy my exit so that I can create a timeline to leave my corporate position. Okay, you've never owned a business before. What are your skill sets that are transferable into buying and operating? Oh, I'm not going to operate the business.
Yes.
Okay, then that's another chasm that we've got to try to bridge the gap between the reality of, and the analogy that I use for those executives is you're going to be dropped into a boat that's moving at a high speed on a lake. And do you know where your dock is? Do you know how to operate the boat? Do you know if it's stuck with a full throttle? Do you know how to stop it? Because that's what it's like when you're buying a business that you know nothing about and you don't have the experience to draw on. Do you have a mentor network? How are you going to make this truly a viable win-win situation? Because who gets into business to lose money? Right. That some of the complexities of getting a buyer to be realistic about their skill sets and ability to jump onto a moving vehicle and get it safely back to the dock.
I love that analogy, and that is so true in every respect. You know, I love the buyers, and we get them all the time. Well, I want to buy a business. I want to be an absentee owner. I want to work, 10 to 15 hours a week, and I'd like to put, a $500,000 or $1 million in my pocket. And we always say, well, when you find it, will you let us know? Because we're looking for the same thing on our end. And truth be told, most of the businesses that we do, if a buyer says, private equity is different, because they usually slot their own person in. But if you're a Main Street buyer and you're trying to buy a business of ours that is owner operator, if you're saying that you're not going to own and operate the business, then you're probably not somebody that we're going to look at. Now, look, if you say that, at the end of the day, if you own and operate it for a few months and you bring somebody in or you hire from within, that's fine. But if you're putting all this money into it and you're going to quit your job and you're not going to run that business and be there every day, that's not a good situation for you. And it's certainly not a good situation for my seller. And especially if my seller's got, some financing at play.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So exactly. You've got to just weed your way through and decipher all of that information and really figure out, is this buyer somebody that you can present to your seller? We always say running a business is a full-time job. Selling a business is a full-time job. When I bring buyers to my sellers, they expect that those buyers have been vetted and there's a reason I'm bringing them to them. And the worst thing I can hear from my seller is, why'd you bring me that buyer? I mean, that puts a pit in my stomach when that happens. I mean, and it does happen on occasion.
Yeah.
Somebody might represent themselves one way, and then you get on a call with them, and then the questions they ask, you're like, oh my God, that would not be a question, and right away. You're like, wait a minute, I set this call up with you, and you're asking questions that are just so inconsequential. You're like, you just want to get the call over with because you're going to hear it from the seller. But it does happen. It does happen. And you explain it and you say, look, I'm sorry. And it's not a perfect world, and you move on.
Yeah, you and I have enough business experience to know how to coach these people properly into discussions. And for me, with someone who's buying a franchise from scratch, they're talking to the franchise development person. They do get the opportunity to talk to existing owners. Sometimes an existing owner will volunteer to my candidate that they're looking for a buyer. Now the whole thing shifts and we go from objective to subjective. Now emotion starts to govern what should be a fact-based research project. Yeah. For anyone who's listening, you can get the idea. Mark and I work really hard on these things, and they are not easy in order to get both buyer and seller to have reasonable expectations that are based on fact. Just like when you were talking about how a business valuation is done. For anyone who's ever bought or sold a house, you're doing it based on real estate comps. So an example that God, it really came home to roost. My husband had built a home with his ex-wife, and they spent $3.2 million building the home of her dreams. Wow. she left with the builder, and Pete moved into a house that was built for a life that had just suddenly blown away into the wind. When he was finally ready to sell in Western Springs, Illinois, affluent area, there were 32 homes over $1 million on the market at the same time that we were looking to sell. And there was no way for Pete to calm down his emotional investment on top of the financial investment in order to reach a satisfying conclusion. He was just pissed off and mad the entire time trying to sell that house, but he knew emotionally he needed to get out of it in order to move on with life.
Right.
But yeah, he took about a 50% hit between what he spent and what it was sold for. So case in point, the original owner puts in a lot more time, money, and effort than a future buyer is, but that seller needs to sell at a reasonable price based on comps.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you know, when you hear business owners, and I was one of them that used to say, well, this is my baby. This is my baby. Well, you know what? That's nice that it's your baby, but you need to treat it as an asset. And truth be told that, you know, most businesses, again, I'm talking the Main Street world, 75 to 80% of that business is that retirement. And so, you know, again, yeah, there's certainly an emotional component. Of course, somebody that's run a business for 30 years, 35 years. The worst thing you can tell a business owner is, I'm sorry, I can't sell your business. It's just not worth anything. And that's a hard conversation to have. And that's why we always try to look at financials first and say, okay, you know, maybe if we do this, or maybe we can do that. You know, one of the things that I do in my practice is what we call exit planning, where we basically say, you know what, your business is not sellable right now, but let's get it in a position over the next 12 to 18 months where we can sell it. Let's clean up your financials. You know, why are your cost of goods so high? You know, maybe we should look at some of your vendors, things of that nature. So, you know, again, Meg, it's part of the process to prepare. And, you know, maybe you need to document all your processes. Again, maybe you need to bring in somebody in your business that if you're not there, you know, knows what's going on. The best narrative on any business that we sell, I talked to an owner yesterday, his business was valued at $5 million. He's never there. I'm like, that's the best narrative ever. Your business is worth $5 million. You're never there. That's what buyers want to hear.